Hello, I'm Rabbi Elton from the Great Synagogue in Sydney, and our personality today is Menachem Begin, born in 1913 and died in 1992. Menachem Begin was born in Brest-Litovsk, Brisk, it was known to the Jewish community, in 1913. His father was a Zionist, and he too followed in his father's Zionist footsteps. He attended a Zionist school, and a little later in his life, as he was approaching maturity, he became a follower of Zev Jabotinsky, who we discussed a few weeks ago. He was therefore drawn not to the mainstream, but to the revisionist version of Zionism. He became a member and then a leader in Beitar, which was the youth wing of the Revisionist Zionist movement, and eventually headed it in the whole of Poland. In the course of the early years of the Second World War, he found himself in Vilna, and in 1940, when the NKVD came in with the Russian army, they arrested him and he was sent to a gulag, where he stayed until 1942. He was then released under the terms of an agreement which covered Polish citizens, and he found himself in Palestine as a member of the Polish army. There he joined the Irgun, the Zionist underground, a military wing of the Zionist movement which had broken away from the Haganah, the mainstream wing which was directed by Chaim Weizmann, David Ben-Gurion, and others. They were involved in sabotage and violent activity in order to drive the British out of Mandate Palestine, and in 1944 they declared an open revolt against the British. That involved, for example, the bombing of the King David Hotel, which was a very controversial action at that time. As important as his tensions were with the British were his disagreements with the other members of the Zionist movement, particularly the Haganah, and there was violence and reprisals of the Lehi, the Irgun, against the Haganah and vice versa during the course of those years. But in 1947 to 48, the different branches of the Zionist enterprise united to fight together in the War of Independence, although the missions undertaken by different groups were of a different character. So, for example, the attack on Deir Yassin, which has been very controversial ever since, in which 100 Arab villagers died, was undertaken by the Irgun, ultimately under the command of Menachem Begin. After the war, Begin entered open politics and became the founder and leader of Cherut, the right-wing party, which was in opposition for over 25 years in the early years of the state. In 1952, he very loudly and vociferously objected to the taking of compensation, reparations from the German government for the actions of the Nazis. He regarded this as a pardon for the Nazi regime, and he wasn't able to accept that. He addressed a crowd in the streets of Jerusalem in 1952 and effectively called on them to march on the Knesset in what looked as though it was some sort of coup, some sort of takeover of the government through violent means. He'd always been distrusted for his authoritarian leanings as they were seen, and also for his demagoguery, or if you were a supporter, his inspiring oratory. In 1973, after many years of opposition, together with other people such as Ariel Sharon, he formed Likud, a party that still exists, and in 1977 they won a landslide victory. The left of Zionism had been in power since the start of the state, and many were feeling disempowered and neglected by what was seen as an Ashkenazi elite, which neglected, for example, Mizrahi immigrants from Arab lands, who were not the beneficiaries of a supportive policy by those successive left-wing governments. As a prime minister, he was in some ways a surprise. He brought in social reforms to improve the lot of his constituents, those who brought him into power, and also he signed the Camp David Accords with Egypt, creating the first peace deal with an Arab neighbour. In many ways, that sets the example for all of the peace treaties which were followed, and came remarkably not from the left, but from the right. He was also involved in the outbreak of the Lebanon War, and it was under his watch that the Sabra and Shatila massacre took place, in which the Israeli army were held somewhat culpable, and Ariel Sharon in particular. He refused to fire Ariel Sharon from the government and stood by him throughout. However, he was so disillusioned, both by the war and by the death of his wife, that in 1982, Begin resigned as Prime Minister. He went not only into retirement but also into seclusion, and went to live in his flat overlooking the Jerusalem forest, where he spent time either by himself or visiting his wife's grave. His legacy in terms of the Likud is extraordinary. It's now become a very successful political party, though it was so unsuccessful in its early years, and also a model for a right-wing Zionist approach, and also a way to make peace even from the right. Many now look to him as a model and look to him as a guide for how a right-wing and robust Zionism can be lived out in a successful and secure state of Israel, and even those who opposed him or even disapproved him during his lifetime could never deny the importance of his impact and the power of his personality. Thanks for joining.